Hi, we're going to get started now. So, you know the drill. This is NNIP Showcase Part 2. And to kick it off, we have Miriam Zach.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I feel like I've really found my professional community, so I really appreciate being here. Okay, so I'm at the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley. We really focus on neighborhood change, gentrification, and displacement research and analysis. In the beginning, how many of you can trace your origin story to the Governator? We can. In 2008, he signed a state legislation to coordinate land use and transportation planning. Planners were really excited about this. This meant a lot more work for us, but communities that were really going to be the ones that were focused on for a lot of this transit-oriented development were really concerned. Communities of color, low-income communities were really concerned what this was going to do to housing prices and displacement in their neighborhoods. So we started some research on this back in 2008. The state was a little slower to respond. In 2012, they released an RFP to do some research on the displacement impacts of transit-oriented development. We had this partnership with state, regional, local, community governments and community groups. We did a lot of data analysis, research, you guys know the drill. And we came up with these maps. We really tried to look not just at gentrifying neighborhoods, but also the process of exclusion and the relationships between the two. Came up with a lot of data, reports, analysis, etc., which we, this past year, published in a book called Transit-Oriented Displacement and Community Dividends, which is available for free for download online. Very cool. And basically, we found that rail stations were much more likely to gentrify and experience displacement. We also, then we went into trying to understand, okay, we get like what's happening, neighborhood change, but how does this impact people's lives and the nature of communities? So we did a bunch of surveys on the impacts of evictions for people in Silicon Valley, really understanding the social, health, environmental impacts of this, but also the relationship to homelessness. We also recently put out this report on the right-hand side of the screen looking at rising housing prices and the resegregation of the San Francisco Bay Area. So we're seeing, people that are getting displaced are moving to lower opportunity neighborhoods, resulting in more segregation. In 2015, when we finished our first study, we found out that the NPO we were working with was probably just going to shelve it. So we put it up online and we made a website, which felt really innovative at the time, which is kind of funny. And by this summer, we reached really, nearly 500,000 people that visited our website. We also started looking at solutions, so through partnerships with the San Francisco Foundation and the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. In 2016 and 17, we did this Investment Without Displacement series, which really laid the groundwork for local solutions, especially around preservation, production, and prevention. That partnership, we had a graduate student that came on around that time, and she said, well, great, yeah, the professionals kind of want to know the solutions, but what about the public in general? And these are still concepts that people say we don't know how to define, we don't know what they are. So we came up with these explainer videos, which are now available on YouTube, reaching tens of thousands of people. More the gentrification than the displacement, so go click on that displacement video so I can get our numbers up. We've also been getting involved in policy, so we've been doing policy briefs, especially on state policy. On your left-hand side, we did analysis of the pros and cons impacts of the Prop 10, which would be expansion of rent control, as well as zoning. We've also been involved in local and statewide task forces and technical assistance around CASA, which was the Committee to House the Bay Area, as well as the Fair Housing Task Force for California, which is really mapping neighborhood opportunity and resources to make sure that tech dollars go to those high opportunity neighborhoods. But throughout it all, people are asking us, what are the solutions? What can we do about this? So we, this year we put out 2 chapters on anti-displacement policy and how we should think about these in that first book and in the upcoming Routledge Handbook on Housing Policy and Planning. Through it all, we realized that there's not a lot of research on the effectiveness of anti-displacement. People are always asking us what works, and we say, well, actually, we don't actually know. So we're doing new projects to try to answer those questions, looking at the displacement impacts of rent control, just cause for eviction policies in California, as well as new housing production, both market rate and affordable. and then the unintended consequences of climate investments for a statewide agency through new partnerships. That is my story. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Miriam. Next, we have Saliki Flingai. Did I?
I cheated, I brought some notes and everything, so I'll be looking down half the time, but hopefully the start will be good. Okay, so my name is Saliki Flingai. I'm a researcher at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Greater Boston's regional planning agency. So climate crisis is one of the greatest issues of our time. So as a planning agency, we're really interested in thinking about how the particular planning challenges of being on a coastal region affects the work that we do and how we can mitigate against climate vulnerability. But we also recognize that climate impacts are not equally distributed, so it's incumbent on us planners, researchers, and everyone to kind of center the most vulnerable populations. So when we think about vulnerability, we are thinking about three key concepts. Exposure, essentially like how exposed are you to a particular hazard. Sensitivity, how do things such as racism or ableism affect your ability to, or your exposure to things, or your access to resources. And then lastly, adaptive capacity, how are you able to use those skills to adapt. So we went about this climate vulnerability assessment using three kind of maps to kind of mirror these three concepts. We mapped heat and flood exposure. We then created climate vulnerability indices, and then we looked at specific vulnerable factors and mapped those as well in relation to heat or flood. So for heat, Caitlin Spence, a GIS and planning analyst, analyzed heat hotspot data, essentially looking at temperature, satellite data, and looking at which parts of the region were exposed to the most amount of heat. And then did the same thing for looking at FEMA hazard flood zone data to look at what areas of the census tract were most exposed to, or were relying within a flood zone. After that, we also looked at a number of climate vulnerability indices. So in addition to the exposure maps, exposure indices, we also looked at sensitivity indices. So things such as living conditions, age and demographic characteristics, health and disease characteristics, and then we also looked at adaptive capacity indicators. So housing stock characteristics, kind of what access people had to information and to vehicle usage and things of that sort. I won't go into too much detail about the methods that we use to aggregate all these indicators into exposure indices, sensitivity indices, and adaptive capacity indices, but I'll show you one way that we did that, which was the arithmetic mean method. So essentially, we found a way to aggregate all these and map them in a way that's giving us a relative current vulnerability assessment of the Greater Boston region. So for heat vulnerability, we were able to create maps on exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and ultimately combine them to a heat vulnerability index that shows, as one would expect, within inner core urbanized regions, you have the most amount of heat exposure and vulnerability. When it comes to flood vulnerability, the flood risk is a little more diffuse throughout the region, but suffice it to say, the places that are still vulnerable along the coastal regions in the urbanized areas have this double vulnerability of being exposed to heat and being exposed to floods. So then, we then looked at individual specific vulnerable populations or risk factors in health, housing, poverty, or information access, social networks, and mobility. Mapped the areas within the region that had the highest concentrations of those populations or those risk factors, and then overlaid our heat and flood maps to see which places were most vulnerable for those specific populations. So for example, looking at 65 plus older adults who live alone as a major risk factor for heat impacts, we were able to isolate the populations, map them out, and then also look at where they overlay flood and heat exposure. So the key takeaways, I won't go into the findings, you've all heard them, but for the process findings were really interesting. For one, working with planners in this process makes everything useful for them. Quantifying and even defining vulnerability is really complicated. And lastly, ground truthing is really important, and that's our next step. We have some limitations with this work. For one, we couldn't really tackle intersectionality as much as we wanted to, looking at how different types of systems interact to make risk more or less. For certain populations, we have some issues with the flood data that we're working through. But suffice it to say, we are going to try to make this a municipal level analysis, bring in a ground truth, and we're going to try to find ways to work with communities to plan with this information. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Ryan Brenner.
All right, great. I'm Ryan Brenner. I'm with the NYU Furman Center, and we're starting a new project looking at the relationship between neighborhood change and eviction using the city's housing court data. So this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the complexity with that and then make a call for any ideas that you all have. So this work falls within our looking at neighborhood change and displacement. So to conceptualize this, if we have some baseline displacement rate followed by neighborhood change, whether that's gentrification or rezoning, what we're interested in is how does displacement respond to this change? Does it increase, decrease, or stay the same? This is a little tricky since there are many reasons why a tenant could leave. It could be a voluntary move due to increased resources, a change in preferences, or better options becoming available elsewhere. A lease could not be renewed, whether it's the landlord not offering a renewal or the increase in rent being too high. Or in the city, we have some units covered by rent regulation, which comes with a right to renewal. So the landlord could offer to buy out that tenant. We also have illegal evictions, which is where the landlord does something illegal to try and force the tenant out, such as refusing to make repairs, cutting essential services, locking the tenant out, or harassing them. This is in contrast to legal eviction, which is where the landlord goes through the court due to non-payment of rent or some other reason, like a violation of the lease. There could be involuntary moves due to the neighborhood changing too much or becoming too expensive, a decrease in the tenant's resources, or the tenant leaving to avoid the formal eviction process. A unit could no longer be rentable due to condemnation or being taken off the market, or there could be incarceration, deportation, or a change to the rental subsidy. So depending on your definition, these might not all be displacement, but what we're struggling with is not all this is accounted for in the data. So what's missing from what we have? We have data from the State Office of Court Administration on all cases going through the city's housing court from 2010 to 2017 in all 5 boroughs. So each record is complete from the initial filing all the way through to the execution of the warrant, if it gets that far, and all of the steps in between. So this obviously only covers one of those sources of displacement that I talked about. So returning to our model, we may have, for example, a theory that gentrification could increase the desirability of an area, leading to increased landlord harassment or tenants leaving because they can't afford the area, which would increase displacement. But that's not something that we can look at with this data, obviously, as we're limited to just looking at the formal change, formal eviction. But even with this, there are some ambiguities. So going through the process in New York City, the landlord first has to make a demand. Because this is pre-filing, it doesn't show up in the data, which is why the box is red. But at this stage, we still are missing some displacement, as getting a formal demand of a threat of eviction could cause tenants to leave. So we only see these cases when the landlord files, which is in blue. The tenant can either answer or not. Either case, it will be recorded. If the tenant doesn't answer, the case could move forward with a default judgment and warrant, which is picked up in the next tree, or not, and we don't know what happens there, whether there's displacement. If the tenant does answer, the parties can reach an agreement as a stipulation, or it can go to trial. With the stipulation, we don't have the contents of the agreement, so we don't know if there was an agreement to pay and stay, or if the tenant agreed to leave. So the only way we know whether there's a displacement is if the tenant essentially violates the agreement, and the landlord gets a warrant to try and evict them. In the case of a trial, the landlord could win and get a warrant, or the tenant could win. It's a green box because we know there's no displacement. So a warrant, all the cases before that didn't end, will be recorded, but we don't know what happens necessarily unless the landlord moves forward to try and evict. The tenant could leave on their own without waiting for a marshal to come and forcibly remove them, or they could pay and end up being able to stay. So even with a warrant, the only way we know for sure what happens is if the landlord gets a marshal and tries to evict. So if the warrant is executed, obviously the tenant has been evicted and loses possession, but there is the opportunity for them to request an order to show just cause to either delay or prevent the execution. So if it is executed, the tenant is technically evicted, but they also have an opportunity to make a request to show just cause to regain possession. So they can make that request, which can either be granted and they'll get possession restored, or denied and they'll remain evicted. Either way, though, we know what happens if a warrant is evicted in terms of displacement. If instead they made a request, it could be granted or denied. Because it could either be a delay or a permanent stop to the eviction, we again don't know what happens in terms of displacement unless it was a denial and the landlord then moves forward to execute the warrant. In the case of a denial, similarly, we don't know what happens as we've essentially gone just back to the top with the warrant and don't know what happened unless it moves forward. So these are some of the ambiguities and complexities that we're dealing with. I would love to hear from you all, maybe on one of the camp sessions later today, about how you've dealt with some of these instances of displacement that don't show up in the data. Thanks.
And finally, we have April Urban.
Hello. So kind of similar to Ryan, I'm going to talk with you about some of our data cleaning strategies, really with the goal of hearing from you what your data cleaning strategies are. And these are specifically around matching address and parcel data. So we've recently become part of a community coalition called Let's Save Cleveland. It's working to improve policies and programs to prevent childhood-led poisoning in Cleveland. We have 3 research components that are a part of our work with this coalition, but the one that I'm mostly going to talk about, or that this work is in relation to, is creating a typology of Cleveland landlords. So super exciting for us because we've built a lot of housing data over time, but none of that is really translated into better understandings of the rental universe. So we're excited to kind of take this next leap with this data and see what we can learn. So we are starting with a really great set of property data and a really great set of processes and systems around cleaning and integrating that data recently. And you can see on this slide some of the components of the data that we collect. Some of them we collect on a weekly basis. Mike Schramm glues them together weekly, and we actually spit them out back into the community. But among all of those data sources, we really haven't learned anything about rental properties over time, and we certainly haven't fixed childhood exposure. So if you know anything about addresses and geocoding, most of our geocoders in life plot points on a street line. But we're really interested in the parcel level of data. So we're taking this, trying to take this data and match it to the parcel. So the first hurdle in understanding information about landlords is really improving this address level data and bringing it into the property universe. But we have a concern about accuracy, right? We could kind of adjust the geocoded points and move them north or south or east or west, but we don't like to do that because we want to be a little bit more certain about the match and the fit between the 2 areas. So here's what we did in trying to solve this problem. For all the data sets where we're dealing with address data, but the information is really about a parcel, we first had to overhaul our geocoding process because it was slow. So we had this great guy who works at the center, spent months improving our geocoding process. And it's a 3-step process, and he's the best person to talk to you about what that actually is. And then, this is really a method that Mike Schramm came up with 15 years ago. We investigated a lot of other options, but this still seems like the best way to go. We run all of our data sets through that geocoding process, and then the standardized address that results we use as a unique identifier, and we join back on that standardized address. But sometimes that way. So with the data that doesn't get matched, because sometimes you'll have 2 address records on a property, but our parcel will only have 1 address, and sometimes the address is just wrong in a data set. We supplement with the Google API rooftop geocode. So that will actually put our latitude and longitude within the shape of our parcel outline, and then we can do a spatial match back to the parcel. That makes us a little nervous because we still feel like, how can we test to make sure it's absolutely accurate? And then we also recognize that in that address, that first sort of round of geocoding and address matching process, ideally, we would be cleaning these addresses, parsing them out, and developing our own kind of address cleaner, even before the geocoding and further improving the geocoding. So once we kind of got our hands into the data, we felt like the data was good. We created this proxy for rentals. We are considering a rental property a rental if it meets one of these criteria. There's more than 1 unit. The owner does not take the owner occupancy tax credit. The tax mailing address is different from the property address, or we see a rental registration record in our building and housing code enforcement data. We did this for quarter 3 in each year of 2016 to 2018. My slides aren't auto-advancing, but I am at 5 minutes. We have some really early characteristics of the rental universe, which are super specific to Cleveland. And we have some super early characteristics by owners, which is the whole point of what we're doing. And they're in this table. And I'm done. So let's talk to you about it.
Okay, we have 5 minutes for questions.
This is for April. With the geocoding process, did you guys use Esri's geocoder? Or did you use your own type of process?
Yeah, so I should expect that and have been a little bit more prepared to answer it, but somebody else
does it. My understanding, so most of our data processing happens in SAS. So we built out, SAS has some kind of geocoding function, and we built out the geocoding function in that. Then we take it into, I think, something called map marker or map info, and then we found that after those 2 processes, we get a lot less utility out of Esri, and I'm not sure if we have like a 3rd component that we may or may not do, cycling the data through Esri.
Other questions? Don't you have a geocoded parcel file for the county?
So the point of geocoding for a lot of our data sets is to tag the geo into another, to tag the data point into a variety of other polygons, like neighborhood, ward, so we can more easily aggregate data. The point of geocoding for address level data to the parcel universe is to create one standardized address across the 2 sources. So our parcel file from the county will have an address associated with it, but if you run it through a geocoder, you may get a slightly different address or a slightly different spelling of the address or some other variation. But if you run 2 of the same properties through the same geocoder, you should get a matchable result. So it's actually, we don't care about the lats and the longs so much for this address, for these address data points. We care about being able to link it to the right property.
Other questions?
I'm going to give everybody a round of applause.